I'm extremely happy and thrilled to welcome Omar Kasmani as our first speaker. Since a long time, we wanted to have him in the colloquium or in one of our events. Now it goes on. Now it's finally there. Not only is it the case that Omar's research and his writing destine him to be an ideal presence at this very workshop, his personality, his demeanor, and practice make him a unique embodiment of the promise of affect as a transformative scholarly outlook in a post-disciplinary landscape of cultural inquiry. Omar is a postdoctoral research associate here at the Collaborative Research Center Affective Societies at Freie Universität Berlin. He's a veteran member of that collective as he's here since 2015. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, his early work was on religious practices in Pakistan. During the last years, Omar has diversified his research very much, which now includes a focus on aesthetics of migration and affective cultures, in particular queer, religious, and migrant forms of belonging in Berlin. Omar is a gifted writer whose careful, smooth, and thoughtful prose, in particular where it conveys effective textures of everyday life, has earned him entry into the hallowed halls of Duke University Press, where his much anticipated first monograph, Queer Companions, Religion, Public Intimacy, and Saintly Affects in Pakistan, is forthcoming in 2022. And he's also working on an edited collection on similar topics with the same publisher. Some of his writing on affect and much else he has written can be accessed at his academia.edu page. So I'm sure you agree when I say Omar is an intriguing interlocutor for Tyrone Palmer in the conversation on the shapes, dimensions, backgrounds, and prospects for affect theory, past and present. Omar, many thanks for joining us today. That virtual floor, or however we should call it, is yours.
Thank you, Jan, for this extremely generous introduction. This is really wonderful also because I really cherish your intellectual company at the center, and I've said this to you personally as well, but I think this is a good moment to reiterate that. Also to be to the organizers for thinking about my work. This is wonderful. It's a wonderful opportunity also to be in conversation with Tyrone's work, but generally to be part of this gang at the center, which I can say is the coolest gang somehow. So it's really nice to be part of this and to be appreciated, involved, and invited. I'm going to share the screen so that then I can start speaking. Can you see it? So I'm not able to see or hear whether you can see it or not.
We see it.
We see
okay.
it.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Here the unrevealed are plenty. Jamal prepares the ground to tell a long tale. It is after dark in a graveyard on the northernmost edge of Sindh, which is an ancient site of pilgrimage on the river Indus in Pakistan. On this November night in 2013, Delphine and I are sitting under a eucalyptus tree. Away from the bustle of the main shrine, this is actually a dwelling amid old graves where Jamal resides. With his audience in place and an audio recorder in sight, Jamal embarks on a performance with his usual mix of word, song, and dance. It's not his first, and it won't be the last time that Jamal breaks into theatrics as he describes his extraordinary encounters in the graveyard. I particularly recall one from 2011, whereby he had come to unearth the forgotten tombs of two fairies from the fabled mountains in the Caucasus, which was now a shrine that Jamal was a self-appointed custodian of. In this moment, however, the site he was describing is not the graveyard itself, but the hill that overlooks it. This edge of town was both remote and steeped in legend. Jamal points to a section of the dreaded hill and says, "There, inside is a figure made of fire, a figure of fire that sings bhajan, bhajan of the Hindus, you know. In no time, he rises from his seat and sings aloud a Hindu devotional song. Before we know it, he is dancing. He utters musical notes as he moves, imitating rather poorly the postures of Hindu deities. Under a single, under a single candescent bulb, this bright spot serves as a perfect stage in an otherwise dark theatre of the graveyard. Fittingly enough, Jamal is in costume. He's wearing a stunning multicolored vest that he had patchworked himself. As he resumes his seat and the story, Jamal identifies the fiery demon in the hill as Devraj, a Hindu mythical figure that protects a grand treasure in the depths of the hill. For good reason, Devraj is watchful of Jamal's presence nearby. In one of their encounters, Devraj promises Jamal boons and bounty, as well as power over the unseen should he fulfill his demands. Jamal's thrill is palpable as he continues the tale. I asked him, "What are your terms?" He said, "Drink this blood of the buffalo." I was like, "Oh, he's going to make me drink blood." I said, "I won't drink blood." At this point, Jamal invokes a rival sacred force and declares his loyalty to the Prophet Muhammad. "If you do not drink blood," Devraj continues, "then chant the name of Lord Krishna." I asked how. He replied, "Om Namaste Deva." I said, "If I were to do Om Namaste Deva, wouldn't I upset my Lord?" Just when we are curious to hear how Devraj responds, Jamal pauses. In the recording, one hears the silence of the graveyard, as if that too were a character in the story. Then, in hushed tones, Jamal resumes, but in a different vein. "Now I'm certain Jesus is about to return. His time has come. The signs have appeared in the world." That night, Jamal's performance would last more than an hour, leaving Delphine and myself exhausted, struggling as always to keep pace with the many figures and storylines he routinely cites in his tales. Complex, polyvocal, and incoherent as Jamal's stories are, his present-day accounts of the graveyard are imbricated accounts of Sehwan over time. His regular encounters with Hindu gods, Shia messianic figures, and Sufi saints, with white souls from the time of the English, as he puts it, and with spirits of an ancient world, are part of the ways in which deeper ecologies and sedimented histories find an ordinary mobilization in the post-colonial present. After all, the town in question is an ancient site of Shivite pilgrimage, which has taken a Sufi guise since the 13th century. It explains why today the place attracts all manner of followers: Muslims, Hindus, Christians. The town's heritage, material and spiritual, is plurally sacred and by all means religiously risque in Pakistan, a nation-state whose post-colonial conception rests on a severance from its polytheistic Hindu past. Hotly contested, yes, but it is Pakistan's most beloved site of devotion. Figures like Jamal are key protagonists in my forthcoming book. These are Fakirs, one among several types of ascetics in the South Asian Islamic Sufi tradition. Whether women, men, or transgender, such persons are known to reject the world and renounce the worldly. In processes of unworlding, they abandon home, question inherited lines, and forego straight economies of family and work, and become fakir, literally meaning poor. Graveyards make for perfect settings of fakir recluse then, because dwelling among the dead is a spectacular embodiment of the prophetic injunction, "Die before you die." The edict stands for the negation of the self among Sufis. In writing about the lives of fakirs, let's say persons who are least likely to be read as futural or aspirational, what entices me is how their affective attachments with deceased saints and their tombs, otherwise emblematic of ascetic self-mortification, can be a means for becoming worldly in Pakistan. In the book, I ask what unfolds or takes hold when individuals like Jamal draw near to deceased Islamic saints, what futures such being intimate with saints affords to individuals, as well as the existing socio-historical relations that enshrined figures frustrate, make awry, or simply expand. Through various Fakir life stories, I argue that saintly affections involve unstraight affordances, that saintly intimacies mobilize futures in excess to ascribe lines of the social, and that individuals overcome conditions of the present so long as they are afforded historically expansive modes of being social. As a side note, I should add that in the Islamic concept, a saint, that is a wali, is literally a friend of Allah and therefore, by virtue of closeness, is privy to divine secrets and plans. The book's interest, or the book's key interest, lies in the affect of intimacy. Saintly bonds are, in the book's view, affective formations that imbricate individual, society, and the state in Pakistan in a public architecture of intimacy. The graveyard now, as where we are now discussing this ethnographic piece, offers an excellent snapshot of such coming close. I read this site as a porous setting where social relations encompass more than those between humans and where Sivan's multiple and pre-colonial histories find routine co-presence. In fact, Jamal isn't the only one claiming such experience. Not far from where we were sitting that night lived Shah Bibi, a woman fakir who in fewer years than Jamal had managed to deepen her presence and claims on the site. Their competing yet complementary narrations of the graveyard are also hauntological citations of what remains submerged in place, or the embodied traces of the graveyard's displaced actors and agencies. In Jan Slaby's terms, we might appreciate these as sustained affective textures through which a sense of the historical is carried over into the present. The felt and enfleshed narrations of place reveal how, to borrow his words, the past lingers on individually and collectively within the depths of corporeal compartment and within material texture of social, institutional, and worldly formations. In Living Among the Dead, or in unworlding, so to speak, fakirs come close to layered ecologies of time and space, which furnish what can be described as worlding with saints. If the term world points us to the context or background against which particular things take meaning or accrue significance, I observe how a certain unstraightness endures through fakir embroilment in more than human knots, sacred enmeshments, and saintly historical affordances. By now, it must be plain to the listener that the affirmative grain of affect studies that I summon through the notion of worlding is exactly what Tyrone Palmer is inviting us to abandon or unthink. This, however, isn't a speaking back to that critique, much of which I'm thrilled by. Rather, mine is a speaking beside, in that what drives my work is a different beef with affect studies. So what is my beef? To animate and mobilize archives, journeys, and genealogies of theory that are otherwise foreclosed by a Western Europe and North America centering grain of affect studies, or how to proceed in quintessentially secular sites of queer and affect theory, which are predominantly shaped by religion's presumed absence. In that sense, the book's articulation of public intimacy through sacred aesthetics and religious affect, or in relation to Islamic saints in particular, regathers affect in ways that do not squarely home in its Euro-American genealogies or remain aslant to its, let's say, unouted Christian history and orientations. Let's return to the graveyard. I was first introduced to Bibi in 2011, though only in passing and while speaking to Jamal in the graveyard. She was then new to the place and still on good terms with her fakir neighbor. I had since approached her many times for an interview. According to Bibi, she needed to consult her sources whether or not to allow me access. The other hurdle was posed by Tony. Not only would the dog not approve of my presence anywhere near her, part of the graveyard that the dog guarded was made off limits for me. By the time I was able to overcome such obstacles, Bibi's relations with Jamal had soured. It was early evening and the sun hadn't set yet. We were sitting inside Bibi's home. Though simply laid out, its sprawl and structure were much more elaborate than Jamal's spot under the tree. Propped against its southern boundary wall, on a slightly raised ground, Bibi had cordoned off an entire section of the graveyard. Where there were once wild bushes, now stood a two-room mud structure. Much of it was still dominated by a tree. Around it, in what could be described as her living area, Tony and I made for a small but focused audience. I was particularly interested in learning how she had come to live in the graveyard. Bibi's situation in the graveyard came with its own demands after all. Life among the dead wasn't easy. In order to endure the spirits and demons local to the site, also a performance of the Fakir body, Bibi followed a strict regime of prohibitions that determine codes of diet, dress, and sexual practice. At one point during our interview, mid-sentence, Bibi turned quiet. She had her eyes closed and her index finger pointed upwards towards the sky. I saw her experience a continuous wave of yawns. She shivered and shuddered as she freed herself of the trembling motion. The entire episode lasted 2 minutes or so. Upon reciting a silent prayer, she eventually regained her composure and was ready to resume our conversation. The brief disruption, as she would explain to me, was due to otherworldly beings whose routine passage across the seven skies, once at dawn and then at dusk, would affect her in this manner. In a sense, Bibi was conveying to me the extent of her knowledge of the place's hidden or more than visible dimensions, claims that sounded much like what I had heard from Jamal. The earth is made transparent in Sehwan, in Jamal's evocative descriptions. In his words, a graveyard made of glass, such that he's able to communicate with its inhabitants. Like him, though minus the theatrics, she too spoke at length about the special nature of the soil on which we were sitting, the dead that inhabited the earth below us, the more than living beings that looked from above. The important thing to note here is that the shape-shifting and genre-traversing appearances of jinns, fairies, ghost spirits, angels, demons that Fakirs describe are citations of the imaginal. This isn't the same as imaginary, unreal, or concocted. Rather, as scholars of Islam have illustrated, it is an order of reality that for Sufis is a distinct and betwixt realm of perception. In that sense, the imaginal is as reliable as it can be deceptive. Key to Sufi cosmologies, and drawn particularly from the 13th century writings of the Arab Andalusian philosopher Ibn al-Arabi, the imaginal is a significant mode of perception that correlates forms of seeing and varieties of perception across wakefulness and dreaming. It involves both the eye of sense perception and the eye of imagination, and requires the beholder, the fakir in this case, to also be an unveiler, that is, to discern between imaginal and sensory objects. When I returned to Sevan in late 2013, almost 2 years since that first interview, Bibi was firmly grounded in the graveyard. In our new encounters, she revealed to me how she had identified through another vision the exact location of her and her husband's future graves. I was now beginning to see how her growing affective ties to the graveyard and its transference in narrative could dislodge Jamal's claim to the same site. In one of our meetings, she revealed elaborate plans for reorganization of space based on these visions. In a new dream, she was shown where the entrance would be, where precisely the two would be buried, and even the space where pilgrims would gather in the future. So detailed was this dream layout that she was even able to point out to me where the water dispenser would be placed. Stunning as her future plans were, Bibi wasn't the only one deepening her presence on the site. Jamal and Bibi were both invested in long-term physical modifications of the graveyard. Since his arrival in the early 2000s, Jamal had been restoring lost graves based on his visions. He had, as it were, repopulated the graveyard. During my last fieldwork in 2018, 8 years since I first stepped foot in the graveyard, it felt much the same, and yet I knew it was constantly changing. As I met with Bibi and her husband, we were no longer sitting around a tree. A more elaborate concrete structure though unfinished, had come to replace the simple mud dwelling of earlier years. Tony was dead, and Bibi, it seemed, was preparing for eventual death. The new space was laid out around what she foresaw to be a tomb hall. Her dream had taken physical form, and her aspirations in the graveyard were extending into a posthumous future. Jamal's dwelling under the tree, however, was as bare as ever. Though, since our last meeting, he had managed to carve out a raised plateau of sorts from the hill, a large carpet now marked a place for gathering on this flattened piece of land, he had revamped the shrine of the Fairies. On another day during the same field visit, Jamal pointed to a couple of new graves. Some of the unidentified bodies from the deadly suicide attack at the shrine in 2017 were laid to rest in this graveyard. As Jamal spoke of the horrors of that night, one could sense how new figures and features might eventually find a place in his narrativization of the site in the future. I was yet again reminded that the graveyard was, after all, that place where Sevan's ancient and newer histories came face to face. In this presentation, I have relied on the graveyard, one of 5 settings in my book, to give you a glimpse of the expanse Fakirs are involved in and speak of. Here, what ties Fakir labors, despite their different stories, their conflict in the present, and their divergences on the question of the graveyard's future, is the place's affective capacity to bring them in intimate contact with the saintly. Intimacy here is not captured by or directed towards a single locus of devotion or one object of reverence, but by greater imbrications of time and space in a graveyard made of glass, as it were. Their narrativizing is a folding of diverse historical experience into the contemporary, rendered valuable but also credible through distinctly felt and enfleshed modes. What I identify as worlding with saints is entangled with ongoing processes of unworlding. It involves an ensemble of mutual affordances through which a world accrues significance, or its particular and less ordinary mobilization is made concrete. I note that just as unworldly fakirs turn perceptive with saintly beings, saints too, through fakir acts and feeling, find their bearings in the world as the more than living. In so long as intimacy is a revelation, such worlding, unworlding, involves a making present through shared feeling and knowing, not so much what is absent as that which goes unnoticed or acts sub rosa. In the book's more critical terms, this would suggest that what transpires in the graveyard and what it affords individuals by means of relations, knowings, and obstinacies are tied to histories that do not sit straight with singular Islamic pasts. Intimacy here involves Fakir's simultaneous relations with more than human figures, mythical creatures, and spiritual beings across Shi'i, Hindu, and Sufi registers. Viewed another way, intimacy serves as an interface through which multiple, at times unstraight or irreconcilable histories are channeled, and in whose wake fakirs gain a complex and layered affective consciousness of the place, and by such virtue also of their place in the world. To the extent that intimacy is an unfolding, an inward genre with outwardly skins, as I call it, fakir stories of the graveyard, be they life accounts or the miraculous feats of others, are threads through which their ties to the world are densely made, unmade, and remade. These are also ways in which a sense of thinness prevails, a porous worlding, so to speak, that is critically intimate with its many pasts and affectively continuous with other times and places. The graveyard that Bibi and Jamal describe is not a singular or fixed setting, neither a static space of buried corpses. Instead, it is animated by souls from below and above, beings from within and without. Amid the place's many active elements, ecological, historical, and imaginal, through acts of fakir unworlding, I reckon an unstraight world coheres. Thank you.